Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransition male, and today I'm going to be reacting to Dr. Robert Sapolsky on the issue of transgender neurobiology. So I've seen a lot of trans activists cite Dr. Sapolsky in one of his lectures that's going around on YouTube, where he talks about the neuroscience of transgenderism, and supposedly Dr. Sapolsky provides evidence in support of gender identity ideology. Supposedly, he provides evidence to support the idea that you can be born in the wrong body, that you can have a gender identity that is mismatched, with your body somehow, such that your body is wrong. Your body is perfectly healthy, but because you have a mismatched identity, your body is wrong, and you need all this like medical and surgical intervention in order to bring your body in alignment with your gender identity. And because you have this gender identity that can prove that a male is a female, a male is a woman, and also that the sex binary itself is somehow a social construction, and that in reality that the sexual dimorphism between males and females is actually it's like an infinite spectrum, and blah blah blah, and it's like all the typical gender ideological things that the trans actors talk about. Supposedly Dr. Sapolsky supports them. And this is surprising because Dr. Sapolsky, he is a well-respected biologist. He's well known for his research on stress. So he's done a lot of work on stress. He's written, a lot of popular books, give a lot of popular lectures. Very well respected in his field. But he has been known to wade outside of his area of expertise because he just recently published a book on the philosophy of determinism, making a case that, philosophically speaking, we don't have any free will. So he's not afraid to make a philosophical argument. And the point I want to make in this reaction video, the takeaway I want you to have, is that this is not fundamentally a debate about empirical facts. This is a debate about an interpretive paradigm, which interpretive paradigm we ought to use in order to understand the phenomenon of transgenderism. And I'm going to make the case that the paradigm that he's using to understand transgenderism is primarily driven by a moral and political agenda rather than an objective analysis of the facts relative to broader evolutionary theory, which is so surprising because he is a evolutionary biologist to some extent. I mean, that's what he's known for. He's known for talking about evolution. So the fact that he gets this so wrong in order to prop up this political agenda from transgender activists, I mean, it's like kind of crazy, and it kind of shows you how wokeism rots the mind. It like just takes people who are otherwise brilliant and just really smart and like well educated. It like kind of corrupts them such that they're no longer able to think critically because they don't want to come to any conclusions that will upset the transgender activists. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump into the interview, and yeah, we'll see what happens. Okay, let's go.
ul.us right there. All of the resources that we have, including tonight's live stream, get posted on that website, along with other opportunities for in-person events like our trauma-informed workshop, our educator health and wellness day, our mindfulness retreats. All that is available on the cool website, and we just invite you to go there. And you can also request free professional learning for your school or district, as long as you are a public school or district here in the state of South Carolina. Well, as many of you know, we have a bill that's been debated here in the South Carolina State House, Bill H 4624, and we've talked with a parent earlier this year, Jessica Spearman, about.
Of course, not surprising at all. The interviewer starts off a conversation about neurobiology with political activism, because this is what drives the agenda for this interpretive framework, for this paradigm for understanding transgenderism. It's all about politics and morality. It's basically it's moral pleading essentially. So this guy has a political agenda. He wants to be a good ally to the trans people. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, these like progressive, trans allies, like they just, I don't know, they definitely have an agenda. So just keep that in mind when you're watching this, because you'll see that politics trumps everything when it comes to talking about this in an objective manner. So wokeism just corrupts the brain, basically.
About transgender healthcare and why that's important for her and her family. And as we were talking about that, I stumbled across a video from a professor from Stanford, and it was just really, really illuminating. I have this sort of moral position on making sure that we support trans students, trans educators, so that they can be affirmed and have their identities affirmed, so that we don't make worse any kind of mental health issues.
That moralism basically prevents objectivity, because you have a you feel like you have a moral obligation to prop up the dogmatic ideological claim that trans women are women. So therefore, any biological framework that violates that moral assumption, that moral axiom, because that's what it is. It is an axiom that cannot be challenged, that cannot be debated. Because if you debate it, if you question it, you're a transphobe, you're a bigot. So, I mean, this is a moral conversation disguised as a scientific conversation. So, okay, let's keep going.
Or feelings that they don't belong, or feelings of marginalization. And so I felt like as soon as I saw this video, I thought this is really a great piece of information for us to be equipped with as we debate folks around these issues impacting our students and teachers who are trans. So I thought I would invite him. I didn't know if he would say yes, because he's been on so many podcasts, and he's just probably in high demand, but he said yes. So here's who he is. He's a neuroendocrinology researcher and author. He's a professor of biology, neurology, neurological sciences, and neurosurgery at Stanford University. He's received numerous awards for his work, including a MacArthur Fellowship in 1987, an Alfred P. Sloan Fellowship, and the Klingenstein Fellowship in Neuroscience. He was also awarded the National Science Foundation Presidential Young Investigator Award, the Young Investigator of the Year Awards from the Society of Neuroscience, the International Society for Psychoneuroendocrinology, and the Biological Psychiatry Society. So without further ado, let's bring on the star of tonight's show, Dr. Robert Sapolsky. Robert, how are you doing tonight?
Okay, very good. And thanks for having me on, Todd. I'm delighted to be able to put in my 2 cents about this issue.
Thank you. So I watched this video. You were giving a lecture on the neurobiology around transgender human beings, and I thought it would be really helpful, because I think people have they understand in this culture war kind of where they stand on it, but we don't have a lot of deep scientific understanding of what it means to be trans and the neurobiology that impacts us as human beings in terms of how we identify in terms of gender and our sexuality. Can you kind of briefly, or not briefly, but can you kind of summarize the research that you were sharing so that folks who are watching can understand that?
Yeah, let me start off with some necessary caveats. It's not my own research. I'm not a neurobiologist who knows much about the subject. I just have to teach a little bit about it every other year or so. So try to keep up with the literature. I'm presenting what I view as the very solid science, and with no advocacy or political agenda here, even though I do have a political agenda.
Just listen to that. There's no political agenda, even though I do have a political agenda. Like, you can't just put your politics in the back of your mind. I mean, everyone has an angle on this, even me. I mean, but it's just like to deny that there's not a moral and political motivation to sort of jump outside of your area of expertise to weigh into this, that structures how you approach this. I mean, come on, just don't pretend that you have a political agenda, or that there's not an ideological aspect here that makes it such that any conclusion that violates the dogmatic axiom that trans women are women, um like, okay, let's keep going.
And I'm delighted to hear that we have similar ones. But just starting off, I think what I want to focus on a little bit about what is known about the transgender brain, but mostly to take people sort of hand-holding through this process of what we think of as biological sex coming in two flavors and only two flavors is a lot more complicated than that and a lot more multifaceted. And the standard view of one or the other, Coke or Pepsi, A or B, is in fact far less clear than is actually the case. That is much more a continuum when we think about what counts as sex. And I'm using sex here in the biological sense, rat sex, monkey sex, all of that, as opposed to the social construct of gender. So I'm definitely coming at this as a hard-assed scientist.
Yeah. So how do you, when this conversation takes place, I think that's one place where we need to start is making that distinction between biological sex and gender. And I think it's easier to see how gender is a social construct. I think it's harder for people to understand the nuances of the differences in biological sex and not seeing it as this just binary. Can you help people understand how? Let's start first of all understanding how biological sex is not just binary. It's not just male and female as a lot of people want to claim.
Okay, it's interesting stuff. Okay, so what's if you like stayed awake through high school biology and remember any of it, there's a very classic picture of what sex determination is like.
Okay, notice right away, we can already instantly see the flaw in the logic. He's talking about sex determination. He's talking about the mechanisms that determine sex. But we have to ask ourselves, what is sex? This is a philosophical, definitional, theoretical question. What is sex? Because there's two different things here. And another evolutionary biologist, Colin Wright, has had some very clear lectures on this particular topic to point out the importance of distinguishing between sex itself, like what is sex, versus sex determination, which is how sex is determined in the body. So the way to think about this is you have sex. What is sex? Okay, so on that account, sex is having to do with your gametes, large gametes and small gametes, eggs and sperm. And so, there are two types of pathways essentially that you can go down: the male pathway and the female pathway. Then those two pathways lead us down into sexual dimorphism. The sexual dimorphism we see all throughout the animal kingdom, that is basically the foundation for the reproductive strategy, the adaptive reproductive strategy of males and females mating and coming together. So you have, so you have an animal, you're going to have a baby. You need egg and you need sperm, and you have, males and females coming together. And that sexual dimorphism between the males of the species and the females of the species, you have them coming together to make a baby, and that is reproductive sex. So take that concept of male and female. So you have these male and female organisms and they're mating. Okay, so how did they end up male and female? Male and female is the end state. It is defined on these two pathways that you can go down. But when we're thinking about the the developmental pathways themselves, there's various mechanisms that determine your sex. So, like, how does the body wind up male? How does the body wind up female? Like, that is called sex determination. It is how the body becomes male, becomes female. So we have the definition of sex, like what is sex, which is defined in terms of male and female eggs and sperm, the gamete account, which is an evolutionary strategy, versus the mechanisms that determine how you wind up male or female. So those are two, philosophically speaking, we can distinguish those questions about the determination of sex versus like what sex is. And Sapolsky just obliterates that distinction and just doesn't talk about it. But it's incredibly relevant because when we say that sex is binary, that there are just two sexes, male and female, we're talking about at the level of the definitions themselves. At the definition of what is sex, it has to do with your gametes. There's not a third gamete. There's not a third evolutionary strategy beyond the male and female strategies. These two competing strategies. There's the male strategy and the female strategy, and those two strategies are based on whether you have a small gametes or large gametes. And Sapolsky knows this. He definitely knows this. But this wokeism is like distorting it such that he's taking the question of sex as binary, and he's bringing it into the level of sex determination. Okay, and let's just keep watching.
And how it is you wind up having boys and girls, and never the twain shall meet.
So how do you end up having boys and girls? Again, see, it's about the determination pathway, the mechanism pathway, but it's not asking the definition of like what is a boy and what is a girl. Like, what is that? Like, what are male and female? Okay, let's keep going.
Meet. And it's this very clear cascade, starting with your chromosomes. You're either XX, in which case you're female, or XY. That's all you got to work with. It's only those two flavors. Your chromosomal sex then determines what kind of gonads you have. And again, the standard view, the textbook view from back when, is it's completely dichotomized. Either you get ovaries or testes. If you're XX, you get ovaries. If you're XY, you get testes, straightforward. Then gonadal sex leads to endocrine sex, what hormones you're secreting. And again, clear dichotomy. If you're XX with ovaries, you're secreting estrogen and progesterone. If you got testes, XY instead, it's testosterone. That leads to genital sex in the fetus. Do you got a vagina or do you have a penis? And finally, secondary sexual stuff like beards and how thick your larynx is and what your brain is like and all. And this is the classic one. And everybody learns this. And it's a straightforward sort of path to concluding there's two sexes. These are two totally dichotomized biological systems. And what winds up being incredibly interesting is that every step along the way here, chromosomes to gonads to hormones to genitalia to secondary sexual characteristics, it's not so dichotomized. It's something.
Again, he's talking about there being complexity in the mechanisms that determine sex, but he's not talking about like what is sex. like when we go back in time, evolutionary speaking, like prior to sex existing, because there was once a time in evolution that sex did not exist. It was just asexual reproduction. And then later, sex as a method of reproduction started to happen. Well, what is that? That has to do with the evolution, the development of gametes, small gametes and large gametes. And so you have these two strategies of organisms who have their bodies organized around the development of sperm the production of sperm, and you have organisms whose bodies are organized around the development of the production of eggs. And you have these two different strategies, and that's how you get reproduction. You have males and females, and you have them, you have the male impregnating the female, and like that, and this is why we have sexual dimorphism in the animal kingdom. This is why when you look at the animal kingdom, you have a bull and you have a cow. Like any farmer knows this. Any biologist knows that there's males and females. There's not a third thing out there. You have the one creature doing the impregnating, the male, and you have the other creature doing the birthing of the babies. That's the female. These are the two strategies that leads to sexual dimorphism. And yes, is how the body ends up, male or female, complicated. But this idea that there's like this layer cake, there's like your gonadal sex, your hormonal sex, your chromosomal sex, your genital sex, that like layer cake model, that is zoomed in. Like we're zoomed in to the level of like physiology and mechanism. But in order to understand why sex is binary, we have to zoom out. We got to zoom out and look not at, this layer cake in the body of like, these different layers of like, you can have like a male genital sex, but, female chromosomal sex. And, you can have all these mismatches between, like your like hormone levels. It's like a continuum. It's all this, it's like this continuous layer cake model, such that all these different things are like individual variables. We have to zoom out in order to see the evolutionary strategy of males and females. You have your small gamete organisms and your large gamete organisms, and you bring those two together, and that is how you make a baby. And that is an evolutionary strategy. But somehow he thinks that sex binary only refers zoomed in. We're zoomed into the organism. We're zoomed into this reductionistic layer cake model. And that layer cake model is relevant if you're sort of just like looking at, the mechanisms of sex determination, but it's not relevant to understanding what is sex. Like what is the male and the female strategies? Okay, let's keep going.
Think a little bit more like on a continuum.
Interesting. So explain that continuum, so what is it that creates that continuum? How should we look at it instead of this view that a lot of us grew up with or understanding? What are some examples of ways that it's not dichotomous?
Okay, chromosomal level, everybody's either XX or XY. That turns out not to be the case. There's all these admittedly rare variants of chromosomal sex. You can have XYY, XXY, XXYY, all of these rare ones. So these are complicated, and an X.
So these are called karyotypes, and yes, there is a wide variety. There are more than 2 karyotypes. So you can have all these different combinations, XXY, blah, 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 like all these chromosomal, anomalies. And these fall into disorders of sexual development. But in 99.99% of cases, when we're talking about disorders of sexual development, it is unambiguous on the gamete account. And by gamete account, I mean thinking about the definition of sex in terms of, you have your body organized around the developmental pathway that, eventually ends up organizing the body around the production of sperm, and vice versa for eggs. We are thinking about that. And with these disorders of sexual development, it is unambiguous in 99.99% of cases. If you have these different karyotypes, these different chromosomal combinations, like what pathway you end up going on. So yes, there's complexity at the level of the sex determination, but you still end up clearly having your sex go down one of two pathways. In 99.99% of cases, it is unambiguous which pathway you go down, even though there is complexity in the mechanisms that push you down the male or the female pathway. But that doesn't negate the fact that there are still two distinct pathways.
An X does not guarantee a female appearance, a Y does not guarantee a male. So there's a lot of variety at that level. This isn't the most interesting stuff. Where things begin to get more interesting is now looking at the next level, gonads. Yeah, they come in two flavors. It's totally clear. It's not so clear. There's a whole bunch of disorders out there where you get something kind of in between. One where you wind up with people who have a womb and fallopian tubes and testes. Whoa, those are not supposed to all go together. There's another one called ovotesticular disorder, where you get something that's kind of a chimera mixture of ovary and testes.
Okay, so this chimera mixture where you have both ovotissue and testicular tissue is incredibly rare. Like 0.01% of people have that sort of thing. It is incredibly rare. Like incredibly rare. Yet that does not prove that sex isn't binary. Because like, yeah, you have to think about these determination pathways. These determination pathways, there's two pathways, and the two pathways are you go down the egg pathway or the sperm pathway. Now, in some cases, in these chimeric cases, you sort of like you have both tissue. So on the gamete account, you're both male and female because you have both. Your body was organized around the development of both types of tissue. So on the gamete account, you would be both male and female, but that doesn't mean that it's a continuum. It doesn't mean that the sex binary is a continuum, that now there's more than two sexes. It just means that that person is both male and female, but that's still binary because you only have two options. You have eggs and sperm, and you have some people who have, the tissue. But even in these cases of these chimeric individuals with ova and testicular tissue, they're either completely infertile or only one type of the tissue is actually functioning. So there's never been a documented case where someone's body is producing both healthy sperm and healthy eggs. It's one or the other. So even in these chimeric cases, it is still usually clear whether you are female or male. So this is sort of a misrepresentation of the facts, and it is just bringing the wrong interpretive framework to understanding this. And we're zoomed in. We need to zoom out and look at the big picture in order to understand that there is a binary between the creatures who are organized around going down the egg pathway and vice versa for the sperm pathway.
Testes, and this thing makes estrogen and progesterone and testosterone and in between. One where you wind up with people who have a womb and fallopian tubes and testes. Whoa, those are not supposed to all go together. There's another one called ovotesticular disorder, where you get something that's kind of a chimera mixture of ovary and testes, and this thing makes estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, and so you can get this sort of thing. Next step further down. Oh, hey, estrogen, if you're female, you secrete estrogen and progesterone, and that's it. No, it turns out if you're female, you also secrete a certain amount of testosterone from your adrenal glands. If you're a male, you only secrete androgens. Nah, you secrete a certain amount of estrogens, and some of the effects of hormones in the brain are by way of that. Okay, so that's not completely clear. Then you get to the area that's really interesting in terms of genitals. So chromosomes to gonads to all of that to, are you going to wind up having a penis or a vagina? And that seems very straightforward. And it's not so straightforward. And there's this whole world of intersexuality out there, which winds up being a debate. Are we talking about disease or are we talking about natural variation, which in a lot of ways is what it's about? Okay, two examples. First one, something called testicular feminization syndrome. It's got a fancier medical name these days, but it's like this irresistible phenomenon, and like there's got to be all sorts of made for TV movies about this. You got a daughter, you got a perfectly normal daughter, things are fine, things are going great, she's growing up, she's 10 or 11, a couple of her classmates are beginning to get their periods, whatever, she's 12, most of her friends are getting their first cycles, she's not. It's not a big deal, but she's feeling a little bit weird about it. Another year goes by, rest of the kids still not, what's up, what's wrong with me, why am I not normal? Of course, that word's got to come out. So you take her to the doctor, and the doctor examines her, and everything seems like she's going through puberty and she's got a vagina in the right place and all that. And the doctor goes poking around and eventually sits you down and says, well, fortunately, there's no scary disease here. You have a perfectly healthy child, but your child happens to be a son. Your child is chromosomally XY. Your child has testes up in his stomach. Your child secretes testosterone, so much testosterone that it's like leaking out of his ears. There's a mutation for a gene that codes for a thing called the testosterone receptor. You got lots of testosterone, but your cells can't hear it. And you wind up with a female phenotype. You wind up with somebody who, up until you had your daughter checked out there, you thought was a daughter. And what's typically done with this is like a clear-cut one. Sometimes it's a little more ambiguous than that. What the most humane medical thing is to not say, "Oh my God, you have a son," but to say you have a totally healthy child who happens she will never be able to have a child because she has no ovaries, because there's a fertility problem here. So that one's out there. Then there's an even weirder one.
So that person on the gamete account is a male. So we like have to keep our mind clear here. Otherwise, we're liable to get confused by the social stuff, by the cultural stuff, by the cultural signifiers in regards to, how do we deal with these anomalies? Because they are anomalies. These are disorders of sexual development. So ordinary, normal, healthy organisms just go down the male or the female pathway. And that sex determination process is straightforward. In some cases, when you have a disorder, that sex determination pathway, those mechanisms get distorted in some way. And so, you have a male who, phenotypically, so in terms of the determination mechanisms, you sort of your body isn't standard, but that doesn't mean that you didn't go down a particular pathway. You on the gamete account, it is still clear that that person is male. So that doesn't provide evidence that there's now this third thing or this fourth thing or this fifth thing, that there's, so suddenly now there's like a third gamete that, determines, a new way of reproducing, other than just the combination of, sperm and egg or whatever. So I don't know. It's just like it doesn't really follow. It doesn't support the argument that there's more than two sexes.
And this is, again, a mutation. This one is called 5-alpha reductase deficiency. And it's found in this one inbred population way up in the mountains in the Dominican Republic, and another population way up in the mountains in New Guinea. Like medical geneticists, like like love the highlands of New Guinea because you get these isolated populations up there and inbreeding, and you get all sorts of interesting mutations. So here's one of these interesting ones. You give birth to a daughter and everything's fine and all of that. And right around puberty, she suddenly converts into having male genitalia and a male appearance, a male phenotype. What's up with this? This is this mutation and this enzyme that makes testosterone for you, and this is a chromosomal male.
Okay. Also, I just want to note, like, the purported title of this talk is transgender neurobiology, but we're not talking about transgender neurobiology. We're talking about disorders of sexual development, and this conflation of the two things. So, using these disorders of sexual development to prop up transgender ideology, that is just wrong-headed. These things don't have anything to do with each other. So I don't know why we're talking about disorders of sexual development and intersex when we ought to be talking about trans people who are, and like, yes, are there people who have disorders of sexual development who also identify as trans? Yes, but most trans people are not. Uh, they don't have disorders of sexual development. So I don't even know why we're spending 15 minutes talking about disorders of sexual development. Like, there's nothing to do with transgender people. These are two different things. So I don't know. I mean, we could have called this disorders of sexual development neurobiology, but we're not. We haven't even talked about transgenderism yet. So
Who simply was not secreting much testosterone up until around puberty, when there was enough of a surge of it that you have a change. You have a change, and you get this transition from like a vagina to a penis or whatever. And this is something that occurs now and then. It's extremely rare. For my money, the most interesting thing about it is in both of these populations, just on an anthropological level, people deal with it. It's, I don't know, 1 out of 100 births or something like that. And it's just like, you hit puberty. Sometimes you get acne. Sometimes you get a penis and you didn't have one of those before, and whatever. And let's just go about business. Cultural adaptation to this. But the point is, that's another one where you have a continuum. And
I'm sorry. Let me just. I
yeah,
thought Vanessa White made a really good point here, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on this. She said that it's interesting they're considered disorders. And I heard you use the word disease, disorder, syndrome. Are those some words maybe we need to move away from? Like, if someone has a blue and a brown eye, do we call that a disorder just because it's rare? Or like, what are your thoughts on on the terminology around these? I don't know if we would call them conditions or genetic anomalies.
it is like a fantastic question, because who gets to decide what's normal and how much variation is there around it, and what counts as like normal human variability versus a disease, and who decides if this is it? Yeah, this is like a perpetual massive challenge in the field. And often what it revolves around is, well, just how prevalent is this? How many people are there out there? And this is where an astonishing factoid comes in. So you have these individuals. It's very rare with this testicular feminization syndrome that it's absolutely, unarguably, a female genitalia, or with this isolated population. Often you get elements of both. You get somebody who is intersexual, somebody who has elements of both, and where it's often ambiguous at birth if they actually are male or female. How often is this? Walk around on the streets of your community or whatever, and walk past the maternity ward, and the odds that a child has been born there with sexually ambiguous genitalia is greater than the odds that walking around your town, you've walked past someone with an IQ of 140 or higher.
Interesting.
there's a higher prevalence of sexually ambiguous genitalia at birth than there is of, somebody who's 2 standard deviations out in their IQ or whatever. So having an IQ of 141 a disease? No, it's just a very rare version of normal human variability. And, disease labeling is often in the eyes of the beholder, and there's endless remarkable stories in sort of history of medicine of people who have a disease where you could fix them and it turns out they don't think they have a disease and they're doing just fine, and like great stories with that.
All this like this layer cake model where you have chromosomal sex and gonadal sex and hormonal sex and genital sex and morphological sex and all these different things, and like this is relevant to like medicine and the pragmatics of like culture and blah blah blah, and like how do we deal with this. But that doesn't negate the fact that when you zoom out to the broader evolutionary strategy of sexual dimorphism, of if the male creatures and the female creatures, and they're sort of the males look different and they act different than the females who look different and act different, and there's two different strategies in terms of evolutionary investment. The creatures who there's like what's called the parental investment hypothesis. So basically, when you have more commitment to your parenting as a female, because being pregnant comes at a greater cost. It is much more costly to produce eggs and get pregnant than it is to just blast a bunch of sperm, millions, billions of sperm. So you have two distinct evolutionary strategies. You have the careful resource guarding of the large gamete, where you have a particular reproductive strategy, because there's so much costly investment into the production and pregnancy of that sperm, or of that egg, versus the alternative evolutionary strategy of the sperm strategy. This leads to two distinct reproductive strategies. You have the sperm strategy and the egg strategy. This leads to different behaviors, different body types, different these are two like distinct strategies, and you see this pattern all across the animal kingdom. It is consistent, it is universal, and yes, in that process of the physiological mechanisms determining these reproductive strategies, to build out these reproductive strategies, there are certain mechanisms that determine that. But it it's not the case that there's more than two sexes, because, for example, in some animals, the sex determination is determined by temperature. So it's not like your chromosomes, XY, XXY, whatever, or XX. It's about temperature. So what temperature is the environment. So obviously temperature comes in an infinite continuous range. Now, are we going to say that there's an infinite continuum of sex, because the sex determination mechanism is temperature? So instead of chromosomes determining whether you go down the male or the female pathway, the temperature determines whether you go down the male or the female pathway. So, and because the sex determination mechanism is temperature, and temperature is an infinite continuum, do we want to say that for these creatures there's an infinite continuum of sexes? No, there's still two sexes. There's still two basic evolutionary strategies at play here. You have the small gamete strategy and the large gamete strategy, and he knows this. But somehow we're not able to think critically about this, because this idea that sex isn't binary has become political. It's become political because the trans activists are appropriating all this intersex, disorders of sexual development stuff. They're appropriating all this stuff in order to push the ideological claim that trans women are women, that trans men are men, that non-binary is real. Because but it just doesn't follow. It just does not follow. from this at all, because we're not even talking about transgenderism. We're like 20 minutes in, still haven't even mentioned trans people yet.
So sexually ambiguous genitalia, does 1 to 2% of the population, is that an anomaly? Is that a quirk? I don't know. 2% of the population walks outside and sneezes because the sun is bright. I'm one of those. Is that a disease? Is that an idiosyncrasy? Is that normal? And this is where this stuff is getting into the not just the beholder, but the eyes of those who get to hand out the designations.
I wanted you to, then I apologize for the interrupting your flow there, but you were continuing on through the sort of systems of the laying out the biological differences that are not dichotomous.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, this takes us then to the last step. So, chromosomes don't just come in two flavors, gonads don't, which hormones you're secreting, what your genitalia look like, all of that. So then you get to like other organs in the body, and just given that I've been a neuroscientist since I was in diapers, the thing I'm most interested in is, so what's going on in the brain? Is there a male brain? Is there a female brain? And there's like so many conferences on this and so many fistfights that have happened at then and all that over years. And are there differences in the brain? Absolutely. Based on sex? Nah. Are there differences in the brain that are statistical, that are probabilistic? You look at a whole population of males or female fish or brine shrimp or humans or whatever.
Okay, notice the language. He says, looking at a whole population of male or female brine fish. When he uses the term male or female at the population level, how is he defining that? He is using that term on the gamete account. The gamete account, whether you are a small gamete producer or a large gamete producer. That is how we have to understand the phrase male or female brine fish. So he's talking out of both sides of his mouth. He knows if you go out into the field, go out into the evolutionary environment, if you zoom out, you'll see that there's at the population level, there's male and female fish. Well, what do we mean when we're talking about that? At the population level, we have to think about the gametes. That is the only account that makes sense of this phenomenon. That is the only model that accounts and coherently articulates a way to distinguish between the male fish and the female fish. Notice he's not talking about like a third type of fish. Like he didn't feel it necessary to spell out that there's like 3, 4, 5, 6 infinite number of different types of fish. No, there's male fish and there's female fish.
And are there statistical differences with big overlap? Absolutely. And where do you fit transgender individuals into that picture? So the question becomes, what are the sex differences in the brain? And they're all over the place. You see differences in the size of this part of the brain, depending on differences in how much white matter there is here and the amount of this brain chemical made, all these, and every single one of them is statistical. You can't look at a human's brain and look at any of these sexually dimorphic brain regions and be able to say with any confidence, any accuracy, this person is male, this person is female. There's tremendous overlap in it. So that's the first thing about it. The next complication there with that is, this is like, it's hard to decide if this is just sort of like a great tidbit for cocktail conversation or if how meaningful this is, but there is something called microchimericism in the brain. If you were a woman and you have given birth to a son, while you were pregnant with that son, some of his stem cells got into your circulation and got incorporated into your body, including your brain. You have neurons up there that are XY, while the rest of you or most of the rest of you is XX. Conversely, you're a male fetus, and it goes in the opposite direction as well. Some of your mother's stem cells you've incorporated, including into your brain. So this is amazing, this microchimerism by sex in the brain. It's not clear how important that is versus how just cool that is that that happens. But amid the sex differences in the brain, there's lots and lots and lots of them. So the question now becomes, so what's up with the brains of people who are transgender? And big surprise, this has been incredibly difficult to study because social stigma, because it's tough to study the brain, because in this case, what you really want to do ideally is study someone who says, yes, 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 I am the wrong sex. I have always felt as if I am a them instead of a me. And you get them before they've taken any hormone treatments or things.
Exactly. It's most of this like neuroscientific research trying to find like the neurological basis of gender identity. So you have a male person, they want to be female, they desire to be female, they identify as female. So the question is, if you look at their brain, can we find evidence that they have a female gender identity, a woman gender identity? And these studies, they're always confounded. They're fundamentally confounded because, like you said, these they put them in the scanners after they've already estrogenized their brains by taking hormones, and also they don't control for sexual orientation. In these studies, they don't control for sexual orientation. And when you do control for sexual orientation, you can see that the differences from the control group. So you have the trans women and the non-trans male. So you have two males. One is trans, and the other is not trans. So you have a trans-identified male and a non-trans identified male, and then you compare them to females, normal female controls. Which male looks similar to the female? It is the homosexual males, the males who are exclusively attracted to men. So, and when you don't control for that, you make it seem as if these transgender women have female brains. No, it's just that the homosexual brain is slightly different from the non-homosexual male brain, and that shows up as a correlated difference when you're doing these statistical abstractions. Because when you're doing neural imaging, you're basically looking at your group, your sample, and then you're averaging across the entire sample in order to find a statistical difference at the level of the group statistical difference averaged across all these different subjects. And when you average across all these different subjects, such that you're comparing a trans male, a trans-identified male, a non-trans identified male, and then compare that to females, the males who stick out at the average statistical population level as having a difference that goes in the direction of the female, those are the homosexuals. The trans identified males who are not exclusively attracted to men, they don't show up as having these, distinct female like brain patterns. Okay? So we have to keep that clear. So we are conflating sexual orientation with gender identity and somehow thinking that the fact that a homosexual male shows a little bit of female type chimerism in the brain or whatever, that somehow proves that he's not really a male, that he's actually born in the wrong body. No, you weren't born in the wrong body. There's nothing wrong with your body. You're still male because you're still male on the gamete account of what it means to be male or female. You just are a slightly feminized male, and usually that feminization has to do with like your hormonal wash in the womb or something, like your exposure to testosterone, or your lack of exposure to testosterone, like in the womb. These prenatal hormone washes are often determinative in regards to whether or not you show more of the female typical pattern, but that doesn't negate the fact that you're still fundamentally male. So okay, and I just so we'll keep watching and see what he has to say.
Things like, because that's going to change the brain in and of itself. So that's a complication. So you wade through that, and there winds up being a small, really carefully done literature, and it shows you something amazing. You've got somebody who, for example, was born male, and they say, yeah, so what?
When he says born male, what does he mean there? um He has to be talking about the gamete account. That is what we mean when we talk about that.
Always felt like I am female. I have always felt like it. And you look in their brain, and you look in some of these sexually dimorphic areas, and what you see is, in a lot of those regions, their brain looks more female than male.
Interesting. And how does that, when you say looks more?
So these trans-identified males who have always felt like they are female, we're talking about the homosexual type, because the homosexual type of trans males, they have a earlier identification. So they're the ones who at 3 or 4 years old, they're saying like, oh, I feel female. These are the homosexual type. The heterosexual type, aka the autogynephiles, they often don't realize that they are true, authentic women until they're like 40 years old. So no, they have not, always since a young childhood had this, this like a cross-sex identification. So we're conflating two phenomena of trans identified males. You have your classical transsexual type, who is the homosexual type, exclusively attracted to men, and there's these young super feminine boys. Basically, you have young super feminine boys who are homosexual, and often these young super feminine homosexual boys, they just grow up to be gay men. But in some cases, this cross-sex identification, they identify as women. But in most cases, they like grow out of it. And then you have another type of transsexual male who are these autogynephiles who don't have this early identification. They don't show early signs of femininity in the way that these early hyper feminine young boys do. And these other types of trans women, they might not come out, so take Caitlyn Jenner. Caitlyn Jenner, classic autogynephilic type. Caitlyn Jenner didn't know that they were trans until they were like 60 years old or whatever, 70 years old. You put Caitlyn Jenner in the scanner, they're not going to have this distinctive brain type or whatever that is like a little bit more female in these sexually dimorphic areas. That is tracking sexual orientation because it's tracking these little homosexual feminine boys. But those little homosexual feminine boys who have always known from a young age do not constitute the vast majority of trans-identified males who come into their identification as women at a much later point in time. And they spend their whole life growing up, or like often you'll see these autogynephiles, they'll spend an entire life living a life as a heterosexual male. So they, have very masculine hobbies. They're like computer programmers. They, are like Marine Corps people, like very traditionally masculine jobs. And then like 40, 50 years into their lives, they suddenly wake up and say like, oh, actually turns out my, my like fetishistic interest in cross-dressing is not just a fetish. It turns out I'm, actually a woman on the inside. You stick those people in the brain scanner and you're not going to find that same, that same pattern of the young homosexual type. And so these studies, when you control for sexual orientation, you sort of these brain differences in these areas of sexual dimorphism, they track sexual orientation. They don't track gender identity, because it doesn't track in the case of the heterosexual trans identified males, aka the autogynephiles, who come into their trans identification from a much later age.
More male than female. Let's put a like kind of zoom in on that for a second. What do you mean? What exactly looks different?
Oh, this is like such obscure stuff. You got this little sub area of the brain that 4 people on Earth care about, and you figure out the volume of it, and there's like a sex difference in the volume, and this individual will be more in the direction of the female average than the male average in mid-grade.
Do you hear this? Like, that is not like the fact that these very young feminine homosexual boys have one tiny little bit of the brain that is slightly more in the direction at a statistical population average level, towards looking more like the statistical average population, or the statistical average of like the females on this one tiny little area of the brain. That does not prove that males can become female. That does not prove that males can be women. Why? Because what do we mean by men and women? We are referring to a biological categorization in terms of using English in order to recognize the sexual dimorphism we see in the animal kingdom, in the human species, such that there are the egg producers and the sperm producers. And you see the sexual dimorphism that is necessary for reproductive sex, such that you have, females giving birth. So anyone who has ever given birth, that is a female. And so we have a term in our culture to describe the types of creatures that give birth. The term we've used in history has been women. So even if these homosexual males have slightly differences in these little dimorphic areas of the brain that are, on a statistical average level, slightly more female, that does not prove anything about transgender identity ideology, which is that, you are born in the wrong body, or that your gender identity makes you female. No, it doesn't make you female. Just because you identify as something doesn't make you that something. If they're like, suppose Rachel Dolezal, the transracial person, the white woman who identifies as Black and passes herself as Black, transitioned into Black. She sincerely identifies as Black. Now, suppose we put her in a brain scanner and we found a neurological correlate that shows that her area of the brain is, like, different compared to all her other white people who are not transracial identified, not Black identified. Okay, so now there's a statistical difference between the brains of the white people who identify as Black versus the white people who don't identify as Black. Now, do we want to say that proves that she's really Black because there's a neural correlate behind her delusion, behind her fantasy, behind her wish fulfillment? No, that does not philosophically prove that the white person is Black. Similarly, just because a male person, a person who is male, clearly male on the gamete account, just because they have a brain region that, makes it such that they identify as female, that doesn't make them female. And because woman is a biological classification term that we use in the English language to pick out males and females in the population, just like bull and cow. Like, we have this concept of bulls and we have cows. Why? Because we recognize sexual dimorphism in the animal kingdom. The bulls are the ones that impregnate the cows. So we have this concept of bull and a cow. Two different words to refer to the same species, two different words to refer to the males of the species and the females of the species. Same thing with humans. The words man and woman are perfectly analogous to the words bull and cow. They mean the exact same thing and how they're used. They refer to these different reproductive strategies. So just because you have a male who identifies as a female, that does not mean that a trans identified male is a woman, because that is just philosophically confused. This is a matter of our philosophical paradigms for understanding these things. Um, Yet wokeism and gender identity ideology has corrupted this, has prevented us from thinking clearly, and we're dealing with the level of philosophy and spirituality and religion, such that we somehow think that if you identify as something, you are that something. But no, we don't use that logic in other areas of reality. We don't use that logic with race. And like, race is just as biological as sex. Um like, you split up the human population into these geographically separate areas, such that you have, you like end up having, the Asians breeding separately from like the Northern Europeans, which are breeding separately from the Africans. So you have these divergent evolutionary patterns of, these different races or whatever. And so that is a real biological reality. And so now you have one of the races, the Northern Europeans. If a Northern European identifies as a Chinese Asian person, that does not mean that they are Chinese or Asian. Because identifying something doesn't make you that thing. We accept that basic biological reality, because whether you are Asian or Northern European are mind independent biological facts. Whether you are male or female, according to the gamete account, is an objective biological fact. Just because you identify as something doesn't mean you are that something. And just because there are neural correlations behind that identification process, such that we can say that there is a statistical difference at the level of averages of the group averages at a statistical level, between the males who identify as female versus the males who don't identify as female, that doesn't mean that the males who identify as female are female. That's the whole freaking point. So, okay.
Great overlap. And then you get somebody who, born female, says, nonetheless, I've always felt male. And you look in their brain, and not in all of these areas of the brain that show sex differences, but in some of them, what you see is, you got somebody who is, Pepsi flavored sex according to their chromosomes and gonads and hormones and genitals and everything else, but who nonetheless has always been saying, I don't feel like Pepsi, I feel like Coke. And you look in their brain, and in some of those areas, it's more like Coke. And thus you get this sort of decision.
Again, those are usually homosexual females, masculine, butch females who are the equivalent to the young homosexual males. But that is not the same thing as these little, like, heterosexual females who have autism or non-binary, who don't have gender dysphoria, who were not masculine from a young age, who have all these mental health comorbidities, who, don't have any interest in, or they like don't want surgery, they don't want hormones, they they were not masculine from like a young age. You put them in the brain scanner, no, you're like not gonna find sexual dimorphism at the statistical group average level for like their non-binary identities. Yet they're transgender according to the gender identity ideology, because according to gender identity ideology, in order to be transgender, all you need to do is to have a gender identity that is supposedly different than your assigned sex. Well, these non-binary heterosexual females have a gender identity of non-binary, but you put them in a brain scanner, you're not going to find it in the same way that you find a difference in the brain for these masculine, homosexual, gender non-conforming females, and vice versa. for the homosexual, gender nonconforming males.
Decision, like which counts for more. And, for my money as a neurobiologist, if your brain in some ways is matching what you say you have always felt like you are, like who cares about what's going on down in your gonads or whatever?
It cares because a trans identified male who has gone through male puberty has that they're not female. And so, and we're just trying to be clear about reality. We can't say that a trans woman playing sports who's gone through male puberty is the same as a female, because sex is real. Males and females are different from each other. And we are somehow supposed to convince ourselves that this is all fuzzy. And like, oh man, it's just like, it's so confused. I mean, I don't know. I mean, this video still has like 35 minutes and I'm already like an hour and 10 minutes into my video. I'm kind of wanting to cut it off at this point. I know people are going to say like, well, you didn't let him, get into the rest of his arguments, and like, you like didn't let him present like the rest of the evidence to prove that transgender people are who they say they are. But it's just, you just already tell from this whole discussion that he is just so confused about this, and he should know better. He is a very smart person, but he's getting out of his depth because he's been hoodwinked by these academic gender theorists, by these trans activists, to twist around using mental gymnastics and appropriate disorders of sexual development and intersex in order to, and like, misunderstand these neuroscientific neuroimaging studies that are tracking sexual orientation, that are confounded by the fact that the hormones change all this and blah blah blah, to somehow propping up gender identity ideology, which goes so much further than what the evidence says, because this is about interpretive paradigm. So okay, I'm getting tired of this. So like, I think this has gone on enough. I've like made my point. Clearly, we're dealing with the question of interpretive paradigm. We're not dealing with the question of facts. We're dealing with the question of how to interpret the facts. Keep that in mind. There's raw empirical data, and then there's how do we organize and interpret our conceptual and theoretical apparatus around the facts. That requires an active interpretation. And the interpretation that Sapolsky is making is influenced by moral and political considerations in order to prop up the claim that just because you identify as a woman, you are a woman, even though woman as a concept, as a term, always historically has referred to female reproductive biology in the same way that the term cow versus bull has always referred to those in the cow species, whatever, that are capable of giving birth. So okay, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye bye.